Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's live market update. My name is John Pasalis from Realosophy Realty. For those of you who are new to the show, I like hosting these live updates once a month, typically the second Thursday of every month, to walk through what I'm seeing on the ground, my team. We have David Larock, mortgage broker, also sharing his insights. I'd probably say it's probably the most important video I do on YouTube every month for people who are actively in the market right now or looking at getting in the market, trying to make sense of the trends. There's a lot of information. There are, I think headlines I'm going to talk about today that are confusing to people trying to make sense of what's going on. And really, with this segment, we unpack at least what we see, both in the data, but also on the ground. So this qualitative data that you can't really measure, but it's just the things that we're experiencing and seeing just being active in the business. So as always, Urmi Desai from Moose Marley's here, keeping an eye on the chat. So feel free to post your comments in the chat if you have questions. But we'll just jump right into the discussion. Before we do that, actually, I do have a ongoing webinar information session for people who are looking to upsize in today's market. It is a slow market, obviously. So there's a lot more uncertainty, far more risk if you're trying to time two transactions at once. So you can click the link in the show notes below. I have this info session that unpacks how to navigate this market, how to mitigate risk, whether you're buying first, selling first, buying first, and even how to decide which one to do first. So moving on, before I go into the monthly stats, I thought I'd kind of chat a little bit about, again, some of the trends, some of the headlines. Housing activity has slowed down a lot, even over the past month. A month and a half ago or so, we were seeing neighborhoods, and the market's been slow for a while, to be clear, like since the start of the year. But, 6, 8 weeks ago, there's some neighborhoods, in the city of Toronto and central areas that were still competitive, that were getting, not 15 offers, but 3, 4, 5, 6 offers on their offer nights. Pretty competitive, lots of showing, selling quickly, even, slightly higher end homes. And that appears to have slowed down considerably over the past 6 to 8 weeks for whatever reason, or 6-ish weeks. And what we're seeing on the ground are just fewer showings, more offer nights failing. And for those who aren't familiar with Toronto, like a offer night is when an agent and a seller price their property low, expecting to get multiple offers a week later when they set an offer date. And many of those are failing right now just because there isn't the activity. Buyers aren't in a rush to compete in bidding wars. They don't really care about a seller's offer night. They're far more patient and conservative. And this is partly why these offer nights are failing. So the momentum feels like it has slowed down. When we look at the months of inventory, which looks at, how many homes are available for sale each month divided by the number of those sold over the past 30 days, the higher the inventory, the slower the market, the lower the inventory, the more competitive. And if we look at this on a weekly trend, it has surged over the past month or so, in particular for condos. We're almost at 8 months of inventory for condominiums, and houses has picked up a little bit close to 5 months. So it is a slower, sluggish market right now. We're seeing a lot less activity. Now, having said that, I thought I would kind of touch on a couple of headlines I've seen recently that I think are telling a different story. And this Globe and Mail article talking about how Toronto home sales are up for the first time in 4 months, and as affordability improves. Is this really happening? I mean, listen, what these typically, when we look at sales statistics, we look at how sales have changed year over year. We compare this May compared to last May, and they're both down, whether we look at low-rise homes or condominiums. So sales are actually down year over year. What these articles are talking about is that they're up slightly over April. They do this seasonal adjustment. and then say, well, sales are up slightly in April, so the market must be improving. And then similarly, there's another headline in the Financial Post talking about how prices have ticked up for the first time in 5 months. What is this massive uptick in prices that they're talking about? A 0.1% increase from April to May. This is not an uptick in price. This is a rounding error. So, the headlines I think are a bit confusing. And I've seen interviews with bank economists talking about how they think the market's recovering. These are signs that the market's doing a lot better. And I don't see that on the ground yet. I mean, and what I mean by that is on the ground, we're seeing fewer showings, fewer offer nights, more offer nights failing, less activity overall. So we still see that the market remains sluggish despite what the headlines are saying, despite what bank economists are saying. It still feels very slow. So again, take the headlines with a grain of salt. And I think this is why we like hosting these sessions. There's often a disconnect between what we're seeing and what we read in the news. And at the end of the day, I take, what we see on the ground as being a little bit more realistic lens versus, the statistics that some of these economists are looking at. Now, another thing I wanted to chat about is that when we look at the numbers, when we look at sale prices, average sale prices don't always reflect what is happening on the ground. Average sale prices have been pretty flat since September. They're down slightly year over year, maybe 5-6%. But when it comes to a very slow market, what ends up happening is, sellers are sticky and stubborn until one person just buckles and needs to sell and is desperate. And I talked about this on a recent interview on BNN, where, you don't need every seller to start selling at a massive discount. Once one or two or three in a certain buildings, cut their prices, it resets the market and expectations in that building. So I'm just going to tell a story about one seller I met with back in the fall. We looked at comparables for her unit, and all the comparables were selling in the mid 900s range. If we look at the very same layout, the only difference being just different floors. Fast forward to today, we look at the most two recent sales in May, both sold in the 850 range, $100,000 less than what similar units were selling for just 6 months ago. And again, same layout, same exposure, pretty much the same unit, just the only difference is the floor. And both of these units were actually priced in the mid 900s, which is what the value, the comparables suggested at that time. But in that building, there had only been four two-bedroom sales in all of 2025. These were two of them. And then, one seller ended up selling for $100,000 discount. Perhaps they were motivated. And then a week later, the other one pretty much did the exact same thing, sold for about $100,000 less. So I think these are the dynamics that I think making a lot of buyers anxious because, they're worried about paying today's prices if prices are going to be considerably lower tomorrow. So as a buyer, you need to be very mindful about what you're paying, especially in the condo market that is far more vulnerable. So, these sales probably adjust expectations in that building. They don't necessarily impact the condo market as a whole. When people look at comparables for condominiums, they're looking at comparables in that building, but it does shift the expectations for the average person. So I think these are important dynamics that if you're buying or even if you're selling, we need to be mindful of that one or two people in a building selling at a significant discount can really impact the market. So last thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of, are we going to see condo projects failing? And I did a short video on this earlier this week. And the idea is, for those just to backtrack, a lot of the condos that are completing now were bought 4 or 5 years ago. They were bought at very, very high prices, way above what existing units were selling for. And fast forward to today, they're not worth what those investors paid for them. And in many cases, they bought a unit for $1 million, and the unit's only worth, say, $700,000 today. And banks are helping some of these borrowers by just turning a blind eye to the appraisal, giving them what we call blanket appraisals, which is assuming the unit's worth what the investor paid for it, not what it's actually worth. But we're seeing a lot of other trends. I mean, one trend I noted talked about in my recent video is that there are sophisticated investors with a ton of capital who are stepping in, to buy blocks of units from distressed builders who have a ton of inventory. And this is providing some liquidity and kind of keeping the market stable. But more importantly, we're seeing banks plow a ton of money into condominiums. So I'm just showing a chart from the Bank of Canada. It's from actually a recent report from the Globe and Mail showing lending from Canadian charter banks, non-mortgage loans to real estate developers and construction companies. And it has skyrocketed over the past year. Loans to builders and developers went from 30 million to, about 85. And then they have this category called interim construction lending, which, increased by about 380% from 5 billion to over 30 billion. And this interim construction lending is very likely, builders giving loans to developers who have existing condominium units on their books. They need the projects to close. But the point is that the bank is stepping in and providing liquidity into this market to keep the projects stable and likely to close. Now, I think the important thing to keep in mind is whatever happens with these units, the banks can step in and kind of keep them afloat. They cannot control what happens in the resale market, like the previous example I said, where someone, paid, or someone saw their condo effectively drop in value by 100 grand in 6 months. So the banks, I think, are doing, and probably the federal government behind the scenes, to keep projects closing, to ensure that they don't default. They're investing billions to ensure things go well. And they might not default, but at the end of the day, the banks cannot control what's happening in the resale market. So those are two different dynamics. I think we need to kind of be mindful of that, because I think a lot of people are thinking about and keeping an eye on distressed in the new condominium market. And I'm not as convinced it's going to play out the way many of us had thought. Moving on to the housing statistics for low-rise homes. I don't know if we have any questions, Urmi. Okay, we'll move forward on the monthly market statistics.
No, sorry, John. I'm a little slow on the cursor here.
Okay.
We have a few questions. I think we're going to hold them because
Okay.
a few questions coming up about variable rates. But I did
Perfect.
have a question about the last segment you just introduced.
Yeah.
You're there speaking specifically about new construction that is approaching completion.
Yeah. Exactly. So
So
these
that's
are
a very specific part of the market and not necessarily the condo market as a whole.
exactly. So those new
Mm.
projects that are scheduled to be completed. The concern has always been, what if and the concern that I'm trying to highlight is, the concern is what happens if too many buyers can't close on them? Will the project fail? Right? Because if too many buyers can't close, you can't register a condo corporation. And again, I think what I'm trying to say is I think that is becoming less likely. There's capital in the market. This isn't like the financial crisis in the US, where no one was lending to anybody,
Mhm.
right? Banks were holding their money, and these projects failed because no one wanted to lend a dime to anybody. Banks didn't even want to lend to each other, let
Right.
alone to construction companies. And I think the environment we're in is very different right now. I think banks have a significant incentive to ensure these projects don't fail, and are actually providing a ton of liquidity in this market. So I
And the
think
final question, John, is that a good signal for the resale condo market? Let's say, would you normally expect some, let's say, real, I don't want to say disaster, but something to befall the pre-construction market to eventually spill over and affect prices in the resale?
Yeah, I think if projects fail, I think the concern is that it leads to systemic fears about what that means, how this might you know what I mean? Like, it's almost a sentiment shift.
Hmm.
On the ground, it doesn't really, it's sort of baked in. We're expecting a ton of completions over the next year. And the completions alone, doesn't matter who owns them, is going to impact rents and resale prices, right? Whether whether they close or not, if they don't close, they're just going to eventually close at a discounted price to a new purchaser, right?
Hmm.
But the fear of that collapse happening, I think, is what banks are trying to avoid.
Interesting. And so maybe that answers the question of why we're not seeing bigger price drops in the condo sector yet.
Well, I think those two are different. I think we're not
Mhm.
seeing tons of price drops in the condo sector because people are have been hanging on. I
Mhm.
think most owners have been, you know, are sticky on their prices. Like in the in economics, they talk about prices being sticky on the way down, because they're sellers are loss averse. They don't want to, what they see is sort of losing money. Even though they've kind of made a capital gain, they don't want to sell for less than what their neighbors sold for, and they're very reluctant to. The examples I gave, are very possibly situations where the owner had to sell. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe, you know what I mean? Like, you don't know the dynamics that motivates someone to slash their price by $100,000 in order to sell. And maybe that's part of it. There are a ton of factors going on now. And certainly, I think David's going to come on and join us. Employment and the risk of unemployment historically has always been the risk to house the biggest risk to housing markets. When people lose their jobs and can't afford their mortgage, that's when things become significantly vulnerable, and especially for people who are over leveraged and have tons of investment properties.
Great. Thank you, John.
All right, I'm gonna fly through the stats before we bring on Anastasia and Davin today. So I'm gonna look at some stats for detached homes first. Um, and detached home sales in May were about 3,000. And this is pretty much the lowest level in 30 years outside of COVID. I think in 1998, I'm just looking at the numbers, we had about 3,000 sales as well. So we're basically at the same level we were at in 1998. So this is a very, very soft volume. And I think this is why when I hear some economists see these new headlines about the market recovering, and the market being at a bottom. I mean, maybe it is at a bottom. Maybe we're not going to get much lower than 30-year lows in sales, but I would hardly call this a recovery. This is still a very, very low volume of sales transactions. When we look at the volume of new listings, where are we? New listings here. Again, those are up over last year for Toronto, about 22%, about 10,000 new listings. But more importantly, it's the active listings that are quite key. We have about 14,000, which is a pretty high number of active listings for detached homes for the month of May. There's only been about 2 months over the past 30 years that have had this volume of listings. And then similarly, when we look at the months of inventory, which measures the balance between supply and demand, that is staying at about 4.5 months, which is pretty elevated for the city of Toronto. One thing I'll say is that Torontonians are not used to the fact that this type of activity is normal for a lot of markets. 4 months of inventory is common in a lot of markets, meaning homes don't always sell in 3 days or 6 days or 7 days the way we're used to. That is sort of the normal Torontonians are used to, but a market that is slowish and it takes 2 or 3 months to sell is quite typical. Torontonians aren't used to it. They get anxious because we're not used to seeing that. So I think it's important to be mindful of that and keep that in mind if you're a seller as well. And finally, prices for low-rise homes just over 1.3. They're also down, about 6-7% over last year. Now, when we look at the condo market, similar trends. Condo sales are also incredibly soft, just under 1,500 sales. Condo sales dipped quite a bit more, about down 24% over last year. I mean, how do you call this a market recovery? I mean, I don't even understand what some people are talking about. This is, again, super soft volume in sales. Of course, COVID was lower in May 2022, but the last time sales volumes were this low were about 20 years ago for the condo market. New listings are also, find my mouse here, new listings are surging. They're at the highest level they've been for the month of May. But more importantly, active listings, about 10,500 active listings. We have never had this many active listings in the GTA for the month of May. Last year, we had about 8,000. Before that, the highest we'd have would be about, around in the sevens. So a ton of units on the market available for sale, and many of them just sitting there getting very, very few showings. And months of inventory, again, is climbing for condominiums. 7 months of inventory. And recall earlier when we looked at it weekly, we're actually approaching close to 8 months of inventory now. This is 7 months at the end of May, but right now we're getting close to about 8 months of inventory. And condos, the same thing. They're down about 6% year over year. So we're going to bring on Anastasia and Davin from our office to chat a little bit about some of the things they and we are seeing on the ground in the housing market right now.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Good day.
Davin is active out and about doing photos in Oakville today, so he's in the car. Yep. Beautiful. Anastasia, we'll kick it off. What have been some of the things that you've been seeing on the ground, with your clients, trying to navigate the market right now?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about freeholds because I'm noticing things are changing, especially since last month. There's a lot more inventory entering the market and a lot of options for buyers. A couple of weeks ago, we were looking at a home with my clients in York region. It's been sitting already for about a week, just a week. And they already had an open house. And I called the agent because my clients wanted to submit an offer, and we wanted to negotiate because we see so many inventory. So we really want to negotiate a very good price. So called the agent to see how's the activity, how motivated are the sellers, what's happening on their end. And it's interesting, the agent started giving me the story. He said that it's been very busy, open house was busy, and they have agents calling him and asking him to keep him in a loop because clients are potentially interested to make an offer. I thought that's very interesting because that's not what I'm seeing on the ground. So I thought, okay, maybe I need to double check this information. So what I did, I called other agents in the area who have similar listings. And I told them that I don't have a buyer. I just said I'm looking potentially list a similar property in the nearest future. And I just want to get a sense of the market, what's going on, how is the activity, how are the showings, how are the open houses going. And everyone told me the same story. It's slow. In the past week, they had no showings. And that's been very interesting. Of course, with this information, we were able to negotiate a very good price with my clients. But it's interesting that, it's very slow. And there are buyers out there. They're just not rushing into the market. They're not rushing to see a home. Even if it's a nice house, everyone is taking their time. Everyone wants a deal.
That's a good story. And let me unpack it a little bit because I think not everyone's going to understand sort of the insider, what's going on. Like, I think a couple of things to keep in mind. Even though the market's slow, some areas, some neighborhoods, some pockets could still be busy, could still be competitive, could still have tons of showings. There's these micro differences. It's hard to explain, but it does happen. A surge of people are looking at buying this particular neighborhood and has a lot of activity, even though the market as a whole is slow. So this is one thing that I think, as an agent, you want to try to research and fact check. Maybe I'm missing something.
Exactly, because in this particular neighborhood, there were actually not a lot of listings for this type. And that's where I thought, okay, maybe there is some truth to it.
But you did something, it's funny because you did something, I've never even thought about doing. So typically when we are about to list properties, it's very normal to call effectively your competition and say, how are things going? How many showings have you had? Like it's very common. Not most agents don't do this. Good agents do. And when you call up, most agents are very cooperative. We're in the same business, so they'll tell you what's going on. They're very open. But what Anastasia did, which I thought was interesting, is she kind of framed it as she called from a seller's perspective, but really she has a buyer who's looking at one of the properties and she's trying to get what is actually happening on the ground, which I thought was quite clever. So it's good that you were able to kind of use that information to take advantage of the slow market for your buyer client.
Yeah, and just briefly gonna touch base on condos. Condos, unfortunately, are doing very slow. And I find that even sometimes if you price it low, which seems like a deal, there's still no showings. I had a client who is my long-term client and investor who wanted to see if he can sell a condo and cash out. We listed a property at a very good price, no showings. We lowered the price, no showings. We decided to drop the price very low and see if we can do an offer date, even though it's not the best tactic right now. My client wanted to try it. Still no showings. And it kind of shows that it doesn't matter. It's just, there's no interest.
Is it a small condo?
It is a small condo, yes. So
Okay.
we ended up renting it out.
Mhm.
And yeah, it is a small one bed.
So, I mean, so two things there. Number one, the small market condo is dead, largely because these are typically owned by investors and there are not a lot of investors buying right now. But more importantly, to kind of when we talk about what has kept prices somewhat stable for a while is exactly what your client just did and said, if I can't get the price, I'm just going to rent it. And actually, I forgot, now that I think about it, I was going to put this in my report because I actually looked at some statistics to see how many people are actually doing that this year compared to last year. And it actually is a fair bit higher. And if you just look at the statistics of units that were listed for rent, listed for sale, but then didn't sell and were subsequently rented. And those numbers are actually up quite a bit compared to last year. So we're seeing more condo owners just say, forget it. I'm just going to rent it out. I'm not going to sell it at a discount. So interesting. I got to put that in my next one. I actually did all the stats for it, but forgot to write it. So next time.
Yeah, it's been a common thing I'm telling sellers now. It's not a matter of what price are you going to get, whether it's in your high value range or, sort of on the nose. It's, are you going to sell at all? Like that's got to be a real conversation, depending on what kind of product you have. So it's kind of wild that's the kind of language we use. It's not really price. Is, will this thing even move? Does anyone even want it?
Yeah.
It is a good point. Yeah, and it is a conversation we haven't had before, especially for condos. But quite frankly, even in some cases, houses, and I think this is the risk. If you're going out and you're buying a home first and then selling, there's just that risk. Are you even going to sell in 40 days that you need to sell? Are you going to get enough showings and traffic and offers?
And if you're doing that, like if you're buying a home and have to sell a home, if you're that move up buyer and finally that thing you want and need is in the price point that you can get, well, you have to kind of take a step back and say, well, doesn't this mean that the house I live in has maybe gone down in value as well? So now your math needs to be redone to make sure your proceeds from your sale actually give you what you need to actually buy that home you can now finally seemingly afford. So it's like there's a lot of revisiting strategy, revisiting the value of your own home versus like what things you can get out there in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's a good.
It's a tricky like tricky balance, I guess.
It is 100%. And I have a couple clients in that position, and I think all of them are thinking, if I can get a good enough discount on the home I want to buy, I'm fine taking a little bit of risk on my sale price. But they're trying to get a discount on the home they buy. They're not like rushing in and paying market value on the home they want to upsize to. Like, and in most cases, the homes that they're looking at buying are the type that will get a discount today. So like fixer uppers, homes that need a reno, you know what I mean? Like those homes sit on the market longer. There's not a ton of activity. The prettiest, nicest homes, even if they don't get bidding wars, are going to sell. But the fixer uppers are not going to get, are some of them are selling a pretty steep discount. So
the ones I'm talking about are the ones where, that home that seemingly was out of reach, 6 months ago is now in reach, and buyers are excited, like, oh my gosh, like we can do it. But on the same side of the other side of the coin, it's your own home. If you are, doing an upsize, if you're a first time home buyer, great. This is working out reasonably well. I know it's still expensive, but in comparison. But yeah, again, if you're a move up buyer, then that it really, you have to take a step back, like I said.
Yeah, 100%. Urmi, I don't know if we have any questions for Davin and Anastasia and myself before we.
Hi, everyone. I think we just have some build-ons. Let's go with this one here. See, there's a lot of sentiment things here that I think are better suited to the David Larock portion. But
Sure.
let's talk about the maybe we'll return, John. There's a couple questions around the condos.
Mhm.
And because all of you are working on the ground, maybe it's best to answer them here. So Elena asked, should we expect more price dropping in the resale condo market? So John, I take your point that the pre-con sector, for several reasons, may
Mhm.
not be dropping or as at risk as we think.
Mhm.
We talked a little bit about the risk it still poses to resale. But
Mhm.
given your comments, all of you, about certain seller expectations needing to reset, and I would think condos are the weaker sector than homes, I wonder what you do think over the next few months.
Oh man. I mean,
They're surely
I
not
think it,
going up.
yeah, it's not going up for
Having with the
sure.
easy first. This isn't Price is Right.
Uh,
$1, Bob.
yeah, listen, I think it's a risk when you see what's happening on the ground. I think it's a higher than 50% chance that we're going to see downward pressure on prices.
For sure.
Inventory keeps climbing. That's usually not a good indicator. Unemployment's ticking up. There's still a lot of economic uncertainty. And like I said, you don't need every seller to decide to discount their price. You just need a few or one or two in a few buildings, and it resets the price for those buildings, right? And the expectation. So I think it's very possible. I mean, if I'm a seller if I'm an owner of a condo, I probably wouldn't list right now unless I need to, quite frankly, because it's such a slow market. Like Anastasia said, there's like no showings. Like people who are buying condos want very good value, and even if you're priced a little bit below market value, you still might only get like 2-3 showings a week if you're lucky, right? So
Now, John, on
yeah.
the flip side, and so we have some on our chat participating saying condo prices to go down 30%. Now, on the flip side, I'm in the market for a condo and I find it's not even. The buildings in which people might see a sudden price drop, maybe because there's a lot of inventory or maybe it was on the margins
Mhm,
of that, if we can call it a bubble,
mhm,
is not necessarily where I'd want to live.
mhm,
So what would you look for, or necessarily the condo that I would want to buy and hold value on? So if you are in the market for condos in such
mhm.
a dicey situation, I'm wondering what the three of you would look for example, for your buyer clients.
It's funny you say that. I was actually thinking about doing a webinar or like a session specifically on this, because I think there are people who are thinking about considering buying a condo. They see the slowdown. They don't know when is the right time. And as you said, how to look at this decision and how to mitigate risks. Because as you said, like some buildings, some units are probably going to be more vulnerable than others. So how do you decide where to buy to get value to mitigate risk going forward? And I don't have all the answers now. I think I got to think about them a little bit. But yeah, I think there are things that you can do. Like I mean, the most obvious thing is, I mean, I don't know if I'd be rushing out to buy a 450 square foot investor condo right now. I mean, that should be the most obvious thing, because those are probably going to be the most vulnerable and the slowest, right?
I mean,
Um,
you're talking about micro condos, John, but what I'm noticing is that even though the market's very slow in desirable neighborhoods with condos, even our own where Realosophy is based, Leslieville, you're not seeing a huge dip in prices.
Yeah, again, I think okay. So what you're seeing right now, and for example, if you're looking at Leslieville, those buildings are smaller buildings. Number one, okay. More of them, they're like mid-rise, like 10 stories at most. Many of them are probably owner occupiers rather than 300 investor-owned tiny units. The units are larger, right, on average compared to other buildings. So that's an example of buildings that are very likely to be less vulnerable, right? And not to say that, they're going to keep going up or prices are never going to go down, but they're just less vulnerable than a unit that has 350 condos, average square footage is 600 square feet, and 80% of them are rented out, right? So I'd be more confident buying in a 10-story condo in Leslieville with larger units than I would be in that high rise.
And a final comment to all of you is the split between the downtown Toronto, or what we would call Toronto, and the other areas. So even if we go the east of the city, Scarborough, Etobicoke, and then of course the GTA, are you seeing certain trends or certain, like, for example, I would think that bigger condo units, I'm not sure if they got to the micro sizes of downtown Toronto, but if you do see bigger units, let's say bigger buildings in Mississauga and other densely populated parts of the GTA, are they also more vulnerable?
Bigger condos?
Yes, like you were saying, full of smaller units.
Oh, big condos with lots of small units. Yeah, I think those are the more vulnerable ones. I think generally larger units or buildings with larger units are probably going to do a little bit better. I mean, I actually did this analysis in my latest report. I mean, I'm going to pivot now and talk about rents, for example, right? So if we look at rents for, the GTA, they're down about 10%, but it doesn't tell the whole story. If you look at rents for small units, they're down something like 14%. Whereas if you look at rents for larger 1,200 to 1,400 square foot units, they're down a lot less. And they're actually up quite a bit more over the past 5-6 years. And again, I think a lot of this is just because we're not building houses or condos that could accommodate families, right? So if you're looking at sort of the longer term, those are probably going to do a little bit better, even because our population is still going to grow. Even though non-permanent residents are going to decline, immigration is still going to be up 350, 400,000 people per year. Many of those need livable units. You're not going to, bring their family into a 500 square foot condo. They need 1,200 square feet, whether it's a low rise or a condo. And I think those are probably why they're going to do a little bit better over the next 3-4 years.
And my last segmentation question for all of you, I have a neighbor in a downtown condo here who is now going to move out to Port Hope. They just feel after 7 years of trying to save with their partner in the city, getting that down payment that's big enough for a house they'd really like is going to be more possible out in Port Hope. Now, Port Hope's a really nice suburban bedroom community. And I'm wondering if there are certain strengths in the suburbs compared to other parts of the suburbs as well that we should be looking at in terms of low-rise homes.
What do you mean by that?
Like certain communities, are they just seen as more residential, not as much new building, and therefore more speculative or, subject to a lot of rapid growth? For example, like we've seen in Peel region, some parts of York region.
I mean, it depends on how you're tethered to the city. I mean, if you're working remote, go where you want, go where you like. I mean, if you need connectivity for the city to the city for work, yeah, there's probably a tolerance on the kind of commute that you would do, like how many days and how long. So, for the most part, those communities are, they're well established. They're fine to live day to day, but it's really a matter of each individual person and like not everything has to be connected to Toronto. Like we're have this misconception that like just everything. I know we're a Toronto real estate brokerage, but not everyone has to be connected directly to Toronto. There could be people who work for Toronto-based companies who can live in I don't know, up in Kincardine, Muskoka, or wherever. So I think that's the part that has to be figured out. If you're moving to Port Hope, you're not needing to be really in the city all that often.
I mean, I don't know the Port Hope market very well, but I mean, one thing I'll say is if you're moving out of the city, I mean, I think in this environment, I think it's important to be mindful of where you're moving and what regions might be more vulnerable. Like, Hamilton has a very strong steel industry, right? And I think one of the concerns is, well, if the U.S. continues with these tariffs, will Hamilton have a disproportionate negative impact in their economy, relative to Toronto, where there's a lot of financial services, and if it does, that of course could impact not just the economy, but the housing market as well, if people lose jobs in steel. So I think you just want to navigate a little bit more carefully and be mindful of, if you're doing that, where are you moving to? And are they markets that are more vulnerable than even sort of downtown Toronto?
All right. Well, thank you.
Hamilton would be a very specific example of Hamilton for sure.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yes, and I was noticing amongst just friends, colleagues, a resurgence in kind of looking at those suburbs that have those smaller areas that feel very community oriented and residential. And I wonder if that's going to be something that will be, a segment of even the low rise sector that holds up a little bit better.
Yeah.
over time. Okay, that's great. I hope Elena asked a question about the condo, which kicked us off, and she's now chimed in that it's a 3-bedroom condo. So, Elena, I think what everyone's saying here is that's probably a part of the segment of the market that's a little bit stronger.
Mhm. Beautiful. All right, gang. Anastasia, Davin, thank you very much. And Urmi, thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
We're going to bring mortgage broker extraordinaire David Larock.
Hello.
David, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Beautiful. So for those of you who are not familiar with David, he writes for Move Smartly, shares his columns with us, is a brilliant mortgage broker, and is one of these people who just is on top of everything that is going on in the economy. Bank of Canada, he just follows everything. So it's very helpful to get David's insights into what is going on in the latest economic trends, Bank of Canada reports. Now, David, in your latest column, and I mean, I think this is where kind of we should kick off. You mentioned that you believe the Bank of Canada is going to regret not cutting this month. So maybe you can unpack why you think they're going to regret that decision. What are the things that you're seeing on the ground?
Sure. So, first of all, the Bank of Canada's got a tough job. So I'm criticizing their decision, but I want to acknowledge that, a lot of smart people over there, and the reality is it's a tough job to do. That said, they've got it wrong in the past, and I think they're wrong this time. I think they're once bitten, twice shy. They left rates too low for too long when COVID ended. Inflation went above 8%. That was embarrassing for the bank. That makes them hypersensitive to any inflation pressure that they see today. And I think ultimately they're reacting to that to the detriment of our future economic momentum. Just to quickly explain, when the Bank of Canada changes its policy rate, it takes about 18 months before the full impact of that cut or hike is evident in the economy. So the bank is always charged with the task. Part of what makes their job so tough is they always have to skate where the puck is going. They can't just look at the current environment. Now, they have said that because Trump is so unpredictable and these announcements are coming fast and furious, and he's, there's this new term, Trump always chickens out, taco is being floated around by the traders on Wall Street. So without really being able to pinpoint what tariffs are actually going to be maintained and what level of tariffs we'll experience, they've said we're not going to skate where the puck is going. We're going to react to the current environment. Unfortunately, and one of the criticisms I made in the post is, yes, I recognize that Trump is making it tougher to skate where the puck is going, but I don't think that means you should stop trying. So here's what the bank said last week. It gives an assessment of the market. And this is what the bank said. Number one, growth was stronger than expected in the first quarter, but that isn't the usually good news that you would expect, because in the first quarter, there was a lot of demand brought forward because, for example, businesses were piling up their inventories because they knew that tariffs were coming and they wanted to get their orders in ahead of tariffs. So by the bank's own admission, they're acknowledging that Q1 got a big boost from people front running the tariffs. And they also said that they expect growth to be much weaker in the second quarter. We're also seeing in the surveys, so they survey consumers and businesses about what they're feeling, what their prospects are for the future. They ask businesses whether or not they plan on hiring. They ask if they expect that they'll have to raise their prices in future. They ask customers if they're planning on making any big purchases. They really go into a lot of detail. And the overwhelming response from both businesses and consumers in the soft data, that's what we call the surveys, was negative. They were very concerned, cautious, fearful. Consumers are planning on cutting back spending. Businesses are planning on cutting back hiring. And many times, especially at turning points in a cycle, the soft data leads the hard data. So, for example, the surveys first show that caution and concern, and then within a quarter or two, you start seeing it show up in the hard data. The big key, John, and you mentioned this previously, you touched on this when you were giving your presentation, is employment. If people are worried about their job prospects, they're going to become very cautious. And the unemployment rate bottomed at about 5% 2 years ago, and it's up to 7% now. Generally, when the employment rate increases by about 1%, that's a pretty strong recession indicator based on past cycles. So we've got stronger than expected growth, but the bank acknowledging it expects a significant slowdown coming, because when all the shelves are full, they don't need to restock for a while, and consumers are becoming more cautious. Unemployment is increasing, and interestingly, rate fluctuations don't impact mortgage delinquencies. It's really job losses, because Canadians will always pay their mortgage, even if it becomes more expensive, and they can. But if you lose your job, then you can't pay your mortgage, and that could affect the market going forward. And there's concern and caution about that. Canadians are, unlike in the States where they blew through their pandemic savings, Canadians do have more savings saved up smartly, because they I think expect that they're in for tough times, but they're not going out and making big purchases, and there's a lot of concern. So, and by the way, those tariffs will raise costs. Generally speaking, when tariffs are implemented, or at least as a rule of thumb, about a third of the tariff cost is borne by the supplier, about a third of the tariff cost is borne by the businesses, and about a third is passed on to consumers. So that means if there's a 25% tariff, the consumers don't bear all of that cost. Businesses tighten their belts and take less profit, as do suppliers, and consumers pay about a third of the cost. Now, the reality is consumers are going to be hard pressed to bear any price increases based on both their caution and, in many cases, their hit to income. So it won't take much for price increases to slow demand. And if the cost of basic essentials, like for example, food prices are rising by a lot now, if you have to pay more for food, and you don't have a way to absorb that cost in your budget, then you got to cut back in other areas, in discretionary spending areas. And we are seeing slowdowns in consumer spending. It was flat last quarter. And that suggests that not only are consumers feeling more cautious, but they're changing the way that they spend. So when the bank looks at this, it sees that everybody's kind of dismissing the current data, even though it's not terrible. It's kind of like that moment in the old Roadrunner cartoons, I'm going to date myself a little here, where the coyote runs over the cliff and his legs are still spinning and he hasn't fallen yet. And then he looks down and he sees the ground and down he goes. It almost feels like our economy has come over the side of the cliff and we're still suspended in midair. We've got decent GDP data because of all the inventory piling up, but we know what's coming. And so you might say, well, why wouldn't the bank cut then? With all that expected weakness and the bank acknowledging as much, why didn't they cut? Well, the answer is inflation. They're concerned because even though inflation came in at 1.7 overall last month, our consumer price index, which is below its 2% target, the only reason that happened was because the bank, because the federal government rescinded the carbon tax. And without that tax break, which is a one-time deal and in no way a reflection of general prices in the economy, if you back out that tax hit, that tax break, inflation would have risen again last month. We'd be up in the high 2% range. And core inflation measures, which strip out gas prices and food prices, are now all at the very upper end of 2%, or even above 3%. So the bank is looking at that and saying inflation's taking off again. We let it get out of hand at the end of COVID. We can't let that happen again. So they're talking a lot about the need to rein in inflation and the fact that they'll do that as a first priority. They need their inflation credentials back. They took a hit during COVID. But here's the point that I made in my most recent post, and this is something the bank hasn't directly acknowledged. Yes, inflation was out of control during COVID, at the end of COVID, but we were in a very different situation then. People had a ton of household savings. Everybody, job prospects were rock solid, wages were rising, the unemployment rate was super low. So when businesses came along and said we have to raise prices, borrowers could absorb those price increases without having to reduce spending. Now, here, the thing that really made inflation go nuts was that other businesses that didn't have to increase their prices, that weren't affected by the supply chain issues that we had during COVID, looked at the fact that, hey, the narrative is prices are going up. Everybody is expecting higher prices. It looks like consumers are maintaining spending in the face of higher prices. So let's jack up our prices. And not surprisingly, corporate profits reached record levels. Companies said, well, hey, we got a nice tailwind. Everybody expects higher prices. We don't have to explain that we're raising our prices to make more money. And that we don't have to. So we'll just go ahead and hike our prices. And that became self-reinforcing. Prices got higher, not just because they needed to be because of supply chain issues, but because businesses wanted to pad their bottom lines. And then when these big union contracts were negotiated, a lot of the members of the union were saying, well, look how high inflation has gotten. We need big increases with our negotiated pay raises to keep up with the pace of inflation. And when those contracts are signed, they're locked in for extended periods. So you're effectively locking in these higher costs for these large portions these large labor groups in the economy, and no fault to them. If inflation's 8%, they got to get those increases just to maintain their spending. So that becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, and the bank that is the central banker's worst nightmare. And basically what they're worried about now is that we could see a repeat of that. But what I say in my blog post this week is, hang on, we're not in the same situation as COVID. Everybody isn't rock solid on their job prospects. Wage growth is slowing. Household savings rates are still decent, but people don't have money to burn like they did at the end of COVID. If I'm a business today and I don't have to raise prices, I'm going to think long and hard about whether or not I do that, because if you raise prices now, you probably will see a hit to your revenue line. Sales will be impacted. And I think businesses are much less likely to think that now is the time to try to pad their profitability, because there's a risk that customers just won't buy your product as much, and there's a trade-off to be made. So I think that's the key difference, is that the underlying source of real hyperinflation pressure during when COVID ended is just not evident right now, especially given the survey data, how cautious consumers and businesses are. I don't think the bank has as much to worry about. And the challenge is that a cut now only helps us next year sometime. So, or at the end of next year. So to me, what I think the bank will regret, because there's a delay between when they cut and when it impacts the economy, I think what they'll regret down the road is that they didn't lean in to the weakness in the economy more, and they worried too much about inflation, because there aren't actually, I know the inflation data doesn't look good right now, but all of the circumstantial evidence to suggest that there's real pressure in the economy on prices, it isn't nearly as compelling as it was at the end of COVID. And I don't think they've properly accounted for that, which is where my criticism was based.
That's helpful. Now, just to, I'll ask one question before we bring Urmi on, to play the devil's advocate, because sometimes we have to do that just to have fun. So the inflation data doesn't look great. And I take your point. I mean, we're not going to see this surge in inflation that we saw during COVID, 100%. But, even if it's in the 3 to 4% range, like, isn't the bank handcuffed? Like, at the end of the day, their mandate is inflation. They don't have a mandate to stimulate the economy if we go into a recession. So yeah, GDP can go negative. People can be distressed. But at the end of the day, aren't they kind of handcuffed? Like, don't they have to set policy based on where they think or are worried inflation is going, rather than where the economy is going? And I guess that's the one thing I'm not sure about.
Absolutely. So you're 100% right. The bank has one mandate, and that is to maintain price stability, which it defines as keeping prices at a target inflation rate of 2%. And importantly, within an inflation target range of between 1% and 3%. So it does allow for a range in cases where inflation needs to fluctuate because of other factors. Now that we're up around that 3% band, much less flexibility. interestingly, the U.S. Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. They have to maintain price stability, just like the Bank of Canada does, but they also have to promote employment growth and full employment in the U.S. economy. So they have a different mandate, and you're absolutely right, John. But the thing is, if we get an economic slowdown and a severe one, then the bank isn't going to be managing inflation. It's going to be managing deflation. And ultimately, the bank has to be just as concerned about below target inflation as it does about above target inflation. So again, looking ahead, if you're the bank, you don't just have to account for the risk that inflation will be too high, you have to account for the risk that it will be too low. And if we get a sharp economic slowdown, the bank will wish it had an inflation problem because it is more confident that it can rein in hot inflation than inflation that's, deflation is much harder for the bank's monetary policy tools to impact. As we saw in Japan, it took them 30 years of crazy aggressive monetary policy to get any kind of inflation back into their economy. So you're absolutely right. If inflation is not in line, then the bank has no choice. It has one mandate. It has to follow that mandate. And by the way, that is their defense right now. What I'm saying in response, John, is that I think there's enough data to indicate the economy is going to slow and that a recession at this point seems highly likely. And if that's the case, then the inflation data will soften. Now, some would argue we don't yet know the full extent of the counter tariffs that we're going to put in place because, of course, the tariffs that Trump announces only affect U.S. prices, and the Canadian counter tariffs are not yet fully understood. And that they have said that's something that they're trying to account for because they don't yet know in full what that will look like because Trump's tariffs bounce around all the time. For example, when Trump announced that the steel tariffs and the aluminum tariffs would go up to 50%, Prime Minister Carney didn't respond, in part because I think those tariffs are really going to hammer the U.S. economy. And I think ultimately he's kind of like, okay, well, go ahead and try those tariffs out for a while and see what you think. Because my guess is he expects that that Trump will decide on his own without us needing to respond with counter tariffs. So that's a terrible idea. By the way, the announcement about the steel and aluminum tariffs disproportionately affects Canada. The U.S. buys 60% of the aluminum that it imports from Canada, and it buys about a quarter of the steel it imports from Canada, of all the countries in the world. So, and that was announced the same day the Bank of Canada's decision came out. So the bank didn't account for any of that in their forecasts or in their future planning. And there too, if those tariffs stay in place, for a city like Hamilton, that'll be devastating. And again, to me, the weakness is very apparent. And if we get real economic weakness, I think it's reasonable to think that inflation will cool. It's not guaranteed. We could end up in a situation called stagflation, where we have a recession and we have rising prices. That would be a really tough scenario for the bank to manage, and they have to be concerned about that. But ultimately, when I look at the early signs of wage growth slowing, really cautious consumers and businesses, housing market super slow. Aside from the inventory run up we got in Q1, I don't see a lot of positive catalysts at all for our economy. I think a recession is coming. And if we get a recession, then odds are inflation will cool on its own because demand will suffer.
Okay, perfect. I was actually going to ask you what you meant about, your comments about deflation being a bigger concern. And you kind of just answered at the end there. And I wanted to ask that more for the viewers. But your argument is that the economy goes through a recession, people aren't buying, prices will naturally cool down. That's what your point was, right?
Yeah. I mean, if we get a recession, we're going to see demand fall. If demand falls, then ultimately that is that'll help prices cool on their own, and that is a natural byproduct of a slowing economy. Now, if we slap a bunch of countermeasures on U.S. imports, we import a lot from the U.S. That would be inflationary. But I'm not convinced. I mean, boy, it's a good time to have our prime minister be a former governor of the Bank of Canada. He certainly understands what the effects of his policies would look like. And for example, he may decide that instead of counter tariffs, he's just going to focus on providing fiscal support to the impacted parts of the Canadian economy. And the federal government has done a pretty good job of controlling its debt, unlike the US government. It used to be the opposite. It's not true anymore. The US debt is, and their deficit spending is out of control, and they need to rein it in, although the latest budget from President Trump exacerbates all of the problems in the US. Canada has learned its lesson from past mistakes in decades past, and our federal government actually has some room now to provide fiscal stimulus instead. And if they do that, that'll help counterbalance the recessionary forces. I think in the back of the Bank of Canada's mind, they're probably thinking we want to see what that looks like before we get rates too much lower. And again, all of this is, it's all opinion. I mean, to be clear, I can't see around corners. I'm just assessing what's happening now and where I see us 6 months from now. And I'm thinking inflation is going to be a problem that solves itself. And if I'm right, the bank will wish that it had cut sooner, because if it waits to cut until the data show it convincingly that it no longer has to worry about inflation, it'll be too late because of the delayed impact of those cuts.
Beautiful. One correction, the US budget is not the US budget. It is a big, beautiful bill.
Yes.
So on that note.
Well, actually, it's a big, beautiful bill, and in that big, beautiful bill is a budget. So, and I think it also makes Donald Trump dictator for life in the U.S. as well. Yeah. So maybe the U.S. won't even be called the U.S. anymore. We'll change the name to Trumpistan.
He'd like that.
Yeah.
Urmi, what?
Thanks, Dave. I think Dave's touched on some of the questions from Colin Tyler, who's saying, I think the interplay between the inflation, unemployment threats, recession threats are all being asked in our chat. And I think it's the interplay between all of these things. And what I guess let's leave it. We're hitting at our hour mark here. Is a lot of people are saying, what's next? The sense I'm getting is we really have to see what the signals are from south of the border. I mean, there are some signs that maybe this will, is somebody down there running out of steam? We don't know. But, if it's possible that next month we hear about a deal between Canada and the US, it looks a lot like our current deal, but it's another victory for Donald Trump, or at least packaged as such. Does that change sentiment? I'm wondering what you think what's the biggest thing Canadians will be looking for?
Everything coming out of the U.S. Unfortunately, and it's Trump's world right now, and we're all living in it. So ultimately, I think Canadians will remain cautious until we get some kind of a handle on how things are going to land with Trump and with the tariffs and with trade negotiations, and we're all kind of stuck in limbo until then. So
yeah, and it's hard to trust, from week to week, right? You don't know when that's going to be overturned.
Right. I mean, looking ahead, if anything could happen, that's the problem. Is you try to predict. Trump doesn't even know what he's going to do when he wakes up in the morning, and by 10 o'clock, he's changed the global world order. So the reality is, 6 months from now, if the trade stuff has gone away, the tariffs have been unwound, we've slightly tweaked the Kuzma trade deal that replaced NAFTA. The economy will be on a much stronger footing. And any inflationary impact from counter tariffs will disappear. And the housing market was certainly ready to recover, and there was a lot of positive momentum before all of this trade stuff with Trump happened. So if things end up being diluted and the worst of Trump's threats go away, I think we could see a rapid recovery in the real estate market. But we just don't know right now, and people are cautious. And I think, quite frankly, waiting a little bit longer might not be a bad idea, because the U.S. right now is just starting to feel the effects of all these tariffs. And within a few months, I think Trump will have a much better sense of how markets are responding, how voters are responding, and ultimately, when they start to bite, the real cost of this trade approach will be more evident to Americans. And Canadians sitting back and letting it all happen right now and saying, "Fine, you wanna boil yourselves alive? Go ahead. We'll just sit back and ultimately You know, we can sell our aluminum lots of other places in the world. The steel thing is going to hurt, but hopefully we get a fiscal response to help the that industry bear through it, and ultimately. Sorry, Urmi, I'm wandering a little here, but the bottom line is everything could look very different pretty quickly with Trump, and that's what makes all of this so hard to predict.
Yeah, that's a sense I think I'm getting from the questions and also hearing on the ground. So, listen, we got a little bit of sunshine. Finally, the return to some semblance of good weather here. Maybe we all take the weekend and think of the upside, see if that will happen.
Absolutely.
But plan for the downside. That's
and
good
listen, I
Canadian
tend
thinking.
to agree with David, and we'll wrap up. Yeah, I mean, like it's really interesting because the market can stay like this for 6 months. It could stay like this for 18 months. And I think David's correct. I think the second we get some clarity on what is happening economically, you know, the risk of new tariffs being introduced, you know, in the middle of the night on Truth Social, just randomly. You know, I think this is when the housing market's going to rebound. I think 30-year low in sales volumes isn't normal. I don't think it's going to stay like this, obviously, forever. And I think people are just waiting for the signals. And David, I agree with David. It could just happen quickly. You know, beginning of next year, January, it's a busy market if we get some clarity. But again, if it's not, and you know, U.S. and Canada are butting heads for the next year and a bit, we could be in this slowdown for a while. So very hard to predict or time.
John, sorry guys, one quick last point. The market right now is priced, has a lot of pessimism priced in. Generally speaking, more bad news in a market already priced in for a lot of pessimism doesn't make things that much incrementally worse. There's already a lot of bad news priced in. The flip side of that is if we get some good news, there's not a lot of good news priced in. So good news would move the market more than more bad news.
That's a good point.
You know, I always tell John, we've been in deep crises before, and the minute we see like a hint of sun, Canadians run out into real estate again. So, uh, you know, I'm not sure I would be the most surprised. One last thought, a late question coming in, Dave, if as the American market is hit by inflation and the US bank is enforced to cut rates to try and counter that inflation, I'm really wondering about how the American administration is really splitting off into different zones. It just seems like Trump probably wouldn't even be taking that much signal from the Fed. So what does that look like there, where one may not even care about, you know, the other's mission?
Well, Trump is putting a lot of pressure on the Fed to cut rates. The Fed is saying we're not cutting rates, and we're not cutting rates anytime soon. They've basically tried to tell the market to forget about the idea that they're going to start loosening monetary policy. And with the really aggressive deficit spending that the U.S. is doubling down on right now, I think the risk the Fed might have to hike rates to rein in U.S. inflation is real, especially given all these tariffs, which are raising U.S. prices left, right, and center. So the U.S. could have a significant inflation problem, and that might be one of the things that puts Trump in check. Now, that wouldn't be great news for Canada. We import U.S. inflation over time. There is a delay, but sharply higher U.S. inflation would be a source of inflationary pressure for Canada. My hope is that by the time we were starting to import it, cooler heads would prevail and U.S. inflation would come down. But quite frankly, if you're a Canadian rooting against the current U.S. trade policy, higher U.S. inflation, even if it costs us a bit more inflation pressure, might not be the worst thing if it forces Trump to rethink some of these tactics.
I have a question before we wrap up. I mean, we're not over yet. I'm
Uncertain time.
controlling the end stream button over here, and I want to go on. I have a question for David. I just thought of just as we were talking about this. So Powell's term, so Jerome Powell's the head of the Fed chair. His term is due, I think, next year, right? Like April or May or something like that. So, like, what are the odds that Trump just puts in whoever he wants, who will do whatever he says, and you have Trump's government now controlling monetary policy? And I think, like, I wonder, like, is this just going to be yet another thing that is going to completely screw up financial markets? Because, you know, I think financial markets like the fact that Jerome Powell's there, he knows what he's doing. He's not taking orders, he's getting barked at a lot. but he's doing what he should be doing. You know, and the second you throw, you know, just a Trump kind of order taker, what happens? You have high inflation and they're slashing rates. Like,
Okay, so first of all, Trump appointed Jay Powell.
okay, that's a separate. I know that's a separate issue.
Anecdotally, he appointed him. Just like when he negotiated the Kuzma deal, he said it was the best deal ever signed. And now he says the guys who signed it were idiots, and somebody's got to tell him, by the way, he was the guy who signed it. But he appointed Powell. And in answer to your question, John, Trump would love nothing more than to install a sycophant at the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve who did his bidding, and he wants rates to go down. He'd love to see higher inflation because that cheapens the cost of all this crazy debt they've got outstanding, a huge amount of which is owed to foreigners. But this, I think, would prevent him from doing that. If word floated that he was going to appoint somebody like the Fed version of Kennedy, the vaccine skeptic who's now running the health, or all the other people that he's appointed to the heads of these organizations who are, you know, Pete Hegseth, you name it, who are wholly unqualified, financial markets would tank. And I don't care what Trump says, he notices when the stock market takes a hit. When he announced those tariffs and the stock market plummeted, that announcement about the 90-day pause came shortly thereafter. So the thing that I think would prevent him, John, and to be clear, he can appoint who he wants, but if a name floats out there of somebody who's unqualified and the market drops by 20%, I think he would, you know, again, nobody to know for sure with him, but I think based on the how he's reacted to big market moves in the past, I think he would realize he can't put a clown in there.
Awesome. Beautiful. And I think on that note, we're going to go out and enjoy the sun in Toronto. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks,
thanks,
Urmi,
Dave. Thanks, John.
David. Yeah,
and
Anastasia.
thanks for your viewers and all their fabulous questions as usual.
Yeah, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Yes. And we'll see everybody next month.